duck answers, you're a duck. And basically, if you answer 7 questions on this scale, which we've been using for 50 years, it's pretty well said that you're an anti-Semite. So what's the quotient? Where are we globally? And 5 years ago, the ADL did a survey of 100 countries. It cost $7 million. It was 100 countries plus the West Bank and Gaza, with the exception of Pakistan, where it wasn't safe even to do the survey under a pseudonym in another organization. The results were very disturbing and continue to be disturbing. So as you read every day what's happening in Hungary, or Poland, or France, or Germany, read it in terms of the context of the statistics, which again are not finite, but are very, very disturbing. 26% of the adult population of the world today, 26% of the adults over the age of 18 are infected with serious anti-Semitism. That means that they accept 5 or 6 or 7 or more of the stereotypes of anti-Semitism: Jewish control, Jewish power, Jewish thirst for money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Out of those 26%, which is 1/4 of the adult population of the world without Pakistan, which probably would raise it, 48% believe that Jews are not to be trusted, are not loyal to their country, to their environment, to their religion, to their friends, et cetera, et cetera. That's a very, very serious element of classic anti-Semitism. Then you have issues relating to power, wanting money. The Jews thirst for power in order to make money, or do they want money in order to have power? You can play that game wherever you want. Media is an issue. So basically, globally today, the scene about where Jews, how they are seen is pretty dim, in the sense that 1/4 of the world sees us in classic anti-Semitic terms. It gets much, much worse in North Africa and the Muslim world, where the percentages go to 70, 80, 90%, which is on a side note. If you're looking at what's happening in Europe you have the old, the question is there old anti-Semitism and is new anti-Semitism? And the answer is it's both. It's the old, which is the right wing, which is the classic anti-Semitic that we know historically, partially religious, but now you have a new dimension in Europe. The human conveyor belt of the immigrants who are now coming to Europe from the Arab Middle East and from North Africa come bringing the disease of anti-Semitism, and therefore raise the level of classic European anti-Semitism to a much higher level. You know?
Yeah. Well, but not only do we have it in Europe and throughout the world, but we just had the horrific events in Pittsburgh. We had the march in Charlottesville with the chants of Jews will not replace us. What are we looking at here in the United States? What's happening? Why is this becoming so predominant? And where do we go?
Okay, I wouldn't use the word predominant. Okay, we'll get to that. Okay, that's a very strong adjective.
So apparent.
We as a country are better on issues such as anti-Semitism than most of the world, but we are not immune. So let's look at Charlottesville, let's look at Pittsburgh, and then see it from that perspective. I think, again, from the ADL perspective, from my professional perspective to a large extent, David, from your volunteer perspective in the ADL, Charlottesville, and if you will, Pittsburgh, was not a surprise. That means, again, if you follow, as we have followed, by various measurements, some of it is polling, some of us taking inventory, studying the communities. What we have always said, even people accusing us of hypering anti-Semitism, we've always said that there is a serious level of anti-Semitism in this country. That's the bad news. The good news is that it's latent. The good news is that it's beneath the surface. The good news is that we have, as a community, and as a country, but primarily as a community, developed techniques, or what I would call a firewall, that's short of the fact that we don't have vaccine or an antidote against anti-Semitism in a democracy such as ours. We, throughout the years, developed systems, I would say, containment policies which have worked. So a few of them just do it. The memory of the Holocaust for a long period of time, while it didn't eliminate, while it didn't set a guilt factor, was a shaming factor. So the memory of Auschwitz, the memory of the Shoah, etc., played as a damper to keep anti-Semitic activity, manifestations, outbursts much, much lower. That memory is fading every single day. New generations that don't know, don't understand, don't. In this country, legislation, something to do with it, although in our tradition, in our country, the Constitution permits you to be a bigot. Not only does it permit you, we guarantee you the right to be a bigot. So you can be an anti-Semite, gesund to hate, and you'll have enough lawyers, many of them Jewish, who will stand up to defend your rights to be a bigot. So if that's the case, how do we contain it? And we contain it basically by putting a consequence. While there are no laws punishing you for being an anti-Semite, what we developed is a sort of a social contract in this country that if you are an anti-Semite, there are consequences. Not legal necessarily, but if you're in business, in show business, in politics, at the end of the day, the public will reject it. At the end of the day, and to me, Mel Gibson is the best example. Mel Gibson was #1 in this country on all levels. He was people's choice. He was the best director, the best producer, the greatest moneymaker, and then boom, one day, his anti-Semitism went public. Later, other things went public, wife beating, etc. But the thing that dropped him was his public anti-Semitism. And that's the consequences that worked. And so that's a lesson for others, in politics as well. Doesn't mean that anti-Semites haven't gotten elected, but they haven't been a great success. Maybe one term, maybe two. Eventually there's a price to be paid. That has worked for us. Media has worked for us. We use media to embarrass, which works, especially if you're in business, in commerce, in public life, etc. Also, we use media to educate, to counteract the anti-Semitism. All these things, interfaith, interracial, all these things help to build this social contract. What's happening now is this containment wall is falling apart. The firewall is dissipating. And so to a large extent, it's nothing new. I mean, these are not new things that are happening. These are things that have always been there. And so when our statistics indicated prior to Charlottesville and prior to Pittsburgh, 30% of the American public, 30% of the adults, we're talking about the adults. When I told you about 46% of global that don't believe the Jews are loyal and can be trusted, well, in this country, 30% of the American people believe the Jews are not loyal. Now, 30% is millions, millions. Now, it's there, it's latent. By the way, we have We have dealt with interfaith. We have dealt with Nostra Aetate. We have dealt with the charge of Christ killing for years. It's still at 30%. 1 out of 3 Americans still today believe Jews killed Christ. So what you have in the underbelly of America are millions and millions of people who are infected with the disease and, if you will, the stereotypes of but it's latent. They know better, etc. So why is it happening? Why are we seeing these manifestations now? First of all, there's more coverage of it. That means there's more attention being given by the media. You can discuss whether that's good or bad. But there is a political change in our country. And again, here we come into the delicate issue of Trumpism. It's not Trump's fault. But it's part of Trump. Because what has happened in the country recently in the last, he didn't start any of it. So I'll go back to Charlottesville for a moment. The 200 anti-Semites in Charlottesville were not created by Trump or Trumpism. They were there. And we in the ADL or CRCs, or whoever it is, whose job it is to know where they are, we knew. We knew who they were, we knew where they were, we knew what they believed. So Manishtan, what's the difference all of a sudden? The difference is a chutzpah that they all of a sudden woke up with. They felt that the atmosphere, that the consequences that I talked about earlier, that the social contract is dissipating and it's okay. Because before now, the 200 Charlottesville Mamzerim anti-Semites were smart enough to understand that if they surfaced, if they came out and spoke out, they may have trouble with their job, the kids may have trouble in school, there may be social issues, commercial issues, etc. And therefore they knew enough to keep it in the kishka, or maybe here, but not to express it. But all of a sudden, something happened in our political environment. And they felt emboldened. And what happened was that the political campaign, and Donald Trump as a candidate, removed taboos, removed the things that we thought we had worked very hard to establish as things that are not acceptable. They're not American, they're not Christian, they're not moral, spastic. I don't know how you translate spastic, but it's not, you don't do it. Well, all of a sudden, it's okay to do it. If you can say this, and you can say that, and you can say this, so all of a sudden, they felt that they could march, get their picture in the camera, etc. By the way, they disappeared. Interesting. You don't hear them, you don't see them. A couple of them who got arrested and charged were crying and apologizing, etc. Because when they woke up and they realized that the time has not come yet in America where they can. Again, so that's where we are, is a feeling of emboldenment. Now, Pittsburgh again. The Meshuggah, you got to remember here, he didn't like Trump, so here too you got to be careful. He thought Trump was in the pocket of the kites, okay? So it's not that Trump brought him out of the heaven. He thought that we controlled him, which is another classical. But he again felt emboldened to go public. He felt emboldened to rise up and to act out. But he was always there. And this fantasy and fascination and obsession with Jews was always there, and it's not a manifestation of Trumpism, etc. We need to be careful to understand that. Now, media also plays a role, and politics play a role, because all of a sudden, anti-Semitism has become a political issue. One side accusing the other or challenging the other, and therefore becomes newsworthy. Plus, all of a sudden, anti-Semitism, listen, we go back many years. To get America's media to focus on an anti-Semitic manifestations was tough, because it wasn't news. Now it's news. So it's a conglomerate of what is, what was, the new atmosphere, the new emboldenment. But again, to close up, those of us who follow the level of anti-Semitism in this country, were not surprised, but we were shocked. Shocked because of the carnage. Shocked because of the intensity of Shabbos in the synagogue. That was very, very shocking. But it isn't surprising. It's not surprising because we know it's there and it continues to be there till we get an antidote, which is another subject for another question.
All right. Moving on to another question and sticking with the concept of anti-Semitism. Zionism seems to have become anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. We're seeing reactions to Israel's policies, the government. Can you review a little bit in terms of how that's come about, whether that's new, whether that's been there, or is it just a different form of anti-Semitism that we're seeing?
Okay, irony of all irony. Part of Zionism, part of the dream of Zionism, take aside the religious dream of Israel as part of our religion, tradition, etc. But the political dream of Zionism was to put an end to anti-Semitism, because the philosophers, the Jewish philosophers and sociologists at that time believed that the reason that there is anti-Semitism is we're not normal, we're not natural, because we don't belong anywhere. We're not like all the other nations. And once we become like all the other nations, anti-Semitism will disappear. And part of political Zionism, and it even carried to the point where, if you remember Uganda, that means Herzl wasn't a traditional Jew in the sense that he understood that we prayed to Jerusalem, and none of that. For him, it was the sociological, political aspect that only Jews tomorrow became like all other nations, country, flag. Anti-Semitism will disappear. Maybe then it made sense. The irony and the tragedy of it is that, okay, so now we're a nation like all the nations. We have a country, we have borders, we have a flag, we have a national anthem, etc., 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 and we're still suffering anti-Semitism. And rather than the creation of a Jewish state and Zionism, what really is happening is Israel has become the Jew amongst the nations. To the extent that what every nation is allowed to do, Israel is not allowed to do because it's a Jewish state. I wonder where Herzl is spinning, trying to figure this out, what happens. The other element, so that's an irony. The element in terms of anti-Semites, which we need to bear in mind, is anti-Semites don't need facts. To put it in a simple sense, if somebody calls you a dirty Jew and you tell them, see, I had just laundered and I showered this morning, it will make absolutely no difference. We, in our seichel, in our logic, and this is why we also try to look for answers to anti-Semitism. We do it in a logical way. What is it that, and if we did this, and if we didn't do that, and at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. But there are ideologues of hatred, and they understand that there are techniques. And if you can ride the platform of real things going on, look, take the issue of immigration. There are racists and bigots in this country who are racists and bigots from morning till night. They all of a sudden dance on the platform of immigration. Because immigration is a legitimate political question and issue. How many immigrants, jobs, etc., and all of a sudden, bigots clean themselves on a political platform or a platform. To the same extent, many of the anti-Semites dance on a platform of anti-Israel or anti-Zionism. And I can really close the discussion by quoting the most eminent expert on anti-Semitism, the Pope in Rome. The most recent Pope, in a letter about a year ago on the issue of anti-Israel, anti-Semitism, and BDS, etc., in one sentence said that an attack today on the legitimacy of the Jewish state is anti-Semitism. And that's, at the end of the bottom of it, that's what we're all about. The most frequently asked question that I get from the non-Jewish community is on that issue. Can't I be anti-Zionist and not be an anti-Semite? Or can't I criticize Israel without being an anti-Semite? And the answer to the first one is probably not. And the answer to the second is maybe. So let's look at, because it's the essence of the question of using Israel as a political platform to euphemize bigotry and anti-Semitism. So can you be an anti-Zionist and not be an anti-Semite? And the answer is maybe, if you are that unique, my father would call it shadak, there's this unique person in the world. If you are opposed to nationalism, all nationalism, if you are opposed to Jewish nationalism, but you better be opposed to Palestinian nationalism and French nationalism and American nationalism, Mr. Trump, but you know, if you're opposed to nationalism, you're an internationalist, then you can be opposed to Zionism and not be an anti-Semite. But if the only national movement of liberation and independence that bothers you, that the only movement to have your own country, your own anthem, your own rules, is the Jewish nationalism, bingo, you're an anti-Semite. And there's no question about it. You don't like nationalism? Fine. But I better not catch you dancing on anybody else's nationalist flag. Okay? There are very few of those around in the world. Universalists, there are some, okay? But they don't dance on a platform of Israel. The more sort of difficult question is criticism of Israel. Can't I criticize Israel without being called an anti-Semite? And the answer is yes. But, you know, I would ask the question, let's say a journalist or a politician or whoever it is, I would say, oh, you don't like what this Israeli government does on this? Is there any other country that you ask the question about doing so and so and so and so on this issue? And again, if the only country that you have a question about their policy, whereas 20 other countries in the world are involved in the same type of behavior, or maybe not, and you don't ask the question. And so let's focus from there to BDS. Okay. I think today the organized Jewish community, there's not unanimity, believe that the BDS movement is anti-Semitic. Now I can quote the Pope again, because the BDS movement challenges the legitimacy of a Jewish state. Okay. So based on that, the argument should be over, but it's not. But let's say there is, in the local campus here, Ringling, what do you have here? Whatever, whatever. There's a group of students come together and they want to speak out for truth and justice and equality and decency. Okay. And you want to, to educate the campus and stop people from coming and going relating to these issues. I would also say, God bless you, that's what you want to do. But if you then start boycotting because of what your belief of human rights or social justice or equality, And the only country that you single out is Israel. And you don't have China, and you don't have Cuba, and you don't have Saudi Arabia. I can give you 20 countries. I would still argue that Israel does not belong on that list. Israel's not perfect. But in terms of equality, women, again, not perfect, a lot of ways to go, whether it's LGBT, etc. If you only single out Israel, bingo, you're an anti-Semite. You're not about human rights. You're not about, So your governor, you didn't hear it, today was very eloquent on Airbnb. Now, again, Airbnb, they love Israel, they support Israel, but they won't, on Airbnb you can book rooms around the world. But they won't list the 200 Jewish apartments on the West Bank because it's occupied territory. You want me to give you a list of 20 countries who have not resolved their occupied territory and they still do it? So, yeah, you know what? Sure, you can set that standard, but you better apply that standard equally everywhere around, or you are guilty of anti-Semitism. It's not a comfortable debate to be in, because it's on the college campus, and our kids are involved, and there's a lot of ignorance and a lot of emotion. But at the end of the day, if you challenge the legitimacy of the Jewish state without challenging anybody else's legitimacy, you're an anti-Semite.
So Abe, you told us that we get into a little bit of a discussion about an antidote. And obviously, many, many years into this, we haven't had a successful antidote. What is the antidote? Where do we go, and how can we combat this?
That's a little bit of nostalgia. I came into the Jewish community professionally over 50 years ago. And I was a very, very diligent student. And so I studied pundits, studied the prognosis. And over 50 years ago, most Jewish pundits, sociologists believed that anti-Semitism is a fact of the past, that we'll be looking at anti-Semitism to teach historically against general prejudice. They also believed that this would be a normal state. Okay, but and ironically, I think maybe out of wishful thinking, maybe out of optimism, the sense 50 years ago was that it's finished. We don't have to worry about anti-Semitism. What I think we fail to understand is that when the handiworks of Auschwitz were laid bare, the world did not unite in an effort, all the psychologists, psychiatrists, physicists, chemists, mathematicians, to find an antidote for an anti-Semitism, for hatred, which brought us Auschwitz. Yeah, there was the UN. It wasn't really serious, and I don't think most Jews believe that that's going to be the answer. So, little by little, we came to the realization that we're not about to develop a vaccine against prejudice. And so, what do you do? What do you do? And the question then applies internally and externally. There is a concern within the Jewish community. How do you deal with it? And there's a concern outside. I think we need to address both. I think outside, where we today have come to the realization that there will be no antidote, that it's going to be something that we're going to live with, and that the only antidote or answer we have is education. Education, education, education. Now, education has its limitation. It's slow. It's an ongoing process, and it competes with the negative forces. You can be infected with hatred in a nanosecond. It can come from your peers, which can be your kids or fellow employers or whatever. It can come from home. It can come from church, or mosque, synagogue. And so that the infection, again, there is good news. We're not born bigots. We acquire bigotry. But we acquire it in an instantaneous manner, and to undo it is a laborious process of education and education and education. But we have nothing else. We have nothing else. And part of the things that I mentioned before when we were talking about this firewall is you try to build around as many elements which help the process work quicker while you're educating. Again, what we've lost is media. Okay? Earlier I mentioned that we used media to expose, to embarrass, and then to educate. With fake news, not news, there is so much information out there that it's no longer credible, or you don't know what's credible. You don't know what's real or what's not real. And so the other element that we used very well as part of an education process was this whole dimension of media and communication. And that today is under a question mark. What do you believe, what is true, what is not true, etc. So externally, the answer is still education, education, education. The other element, it's a lot more difficult, but that's what the CRC is all about. That's what you're supporting the CRC, is an understanding we're not alone. And you can't fight prejudice alone. And again, prejudice is a disease. Height, you don't like this one, tomorrow you don't like, it's a ladder. Jews can be here today, there tomorrow, so it's all basically united. You find a bigot, chances are if he doesn't like you, he doesn't like Italians, he doesn't like Mexicans, he doesn't like us. So there you go. So part of the answer, in addition to education, is to broaden the coalition. It's tough because self-interest plays. And there are, look what's happening to the Women's March on Washington. There is, nobody argues, there may be some who still argue that women shouldn't have rights, okay, but aside from a few of those Michigan, most everybody agrees with the advocacy goals of the women's movement, even if you take away the politics of it. So it's not anti-Trump. Let's just take the issues of advocacy, of gender rights, of equal pay, of children's rights, whatever. And look how it has been besmirched by anti-Semitism. And so here was a perfect opportunity to build that coalition of all people who want to see progress, and because others pushed and others didn't stand up. Okay, Farrakhan is part of the issue. There's good stuff and bad stuff coming out. The Democratic National Committee just unpartnered with the march. It's a very, very significant step, giving the reason that it's tainted by anti-Semitism. Okay, so that's, but the tragedy is we need those coalitions. All right, now let me look internally. So what do you do? There's anti-Semitism, it's a reality. What do you tell your kids? I think that to a large extent, we have made a mistake by trying to believe that we can protect our kids from the reality of what's out there. And I guess today, with this, there's very little you can protect them from. So you might as well feed it and explain to them and put it in a perspective manner so that they understand what it's all about. And what it's all about is some of the things that I've said, probably in a different manner, and you couch it differently. But again, out of a sense of pride, yes, there is prejudice. Yes, we've been on the #1 frequently on the hate parade. However, Look at Rome, look at Greece, look at the Incas. They're not here. They were not here. I once went to a seminar that had the question, will Jewish civilization survive the year 2025? Then it was a long time ago, now it's tomorrow. And we brought together a group of scholars who studied Toynbee and Spengler, all the historians of history, to try to find the essence of what is it that makes civilizations survive. And so, when you take a look at the Romans and the Greeks and the Incas and the Hes, all these civilizations, they're gone. And we're still here. And so they came up with an interesting answer, which is, to me, is part of the answer that I hope to taught my children, and hopefully they'll teach their grandchildren. What distinguishes Jewish civilization from all the other civilizations is that when Rome was of Cyrus and in trouble, all the Romans said, I don't want to be a Roman. I want to be something else, but not a Roman. When the Greeks were of Cyrus, and they lost the battles and part of the empire, I don't want to be a Greek. Look at our history. Look at our history. Throughout our history, we've had sorrows. We had a lot of sorrows. We had difficulties. And after every negative event or experience, Jews got up, brushed themselves up, and said, I want to be Jew. I want to continue being Jew. Not all, but the overwhelming majority. You had it after the first destruction of the temple, the second expulsion of the temple. Look at the Jews in our time. Probably the most difficult period of Jews to get up and say, I want to be Jews, were after the Shoah, after the Holocaust. Yeah, I know 5 Jews, which I can count on the finger of my hand, who didn't circumcise their children, but that's about it. But look at us. Look at us after World War II, after the Holocaust. We got up, brushed ourselves off, and said we want to continue as Jews. And we built the state of Israel, and diaspora grew in all communities, etc. Look at Soviet Jewry, my God. Soviet Jewry hibernated, made garnished, ash and blood, and nothing. All of a sudden, Soviet Jewry blossoms way before glasnost and perestroika. And that's the secret of Jewish survival. And that's what you have to teach your children. And it's very important that they understand, we have a history of suffering, but we have a history of overcoming. We have a history of greatness, not only to ourselves, but to the world. And the last area, when it comes to what do you tell your children about, what do we say to us? You have to be very careful that our conversations about anti-Semitism, our vigilance, our concern is in balance with, if we so hype security and the fear and the threat, etc., Jews won't want to send their kids to the Federation, to Jewish schools, to synagogue, etc. It's not a picnic going to shul in Berlin today. I remember it was in Berlin a couple of years ago. It was Purim, and I didn't remember the address of the synagogue. I found it. 3 military vehicles, 2 police vehicles, and behind the wall was the shul. Okay, but we have to be careful to balance the anxiety, the fear, the reality of the reality, to the point where, why should I take my kids? Why should I go, etc. It's not an easy balance. It's not an easy balance. And the Pittsburghs don't make it easy, because the Pittsburgh is very frightening. You want to take lessons? Take lessons from Israel. Take lessons from Israel. They certainly live that balance every single day. And God forbid, after a tragedy, of an explosion, etc., 2 hours later, you won't know where it was. And okay, that's part of who we are. That's part of our faith. But we have to make sure that both elements are exposed and educated, and we're sensitive to.
Okay, before we open this up to questions from all of you, I'm going to pivot a little bit here and go back to it's 25 years since Oslo. We don't see peace. We're concerned about the prospects for peace in the Middle East between Israel and the Palestinians. We do see other Arab countries that are now talking about entering into treaties with Israel, into peace agreements. So you had someone from Iraq, just yesterday I think it was, that has said that we should enter into peace with Israel. You're seeing countries like Bahrain, where they've had Bahraini citizens go to Israel, and the king has said, we need to normalize relationships. What are the prospects for peace today, for Israel and the world? And I want to also overlay that a little bit with what we see as divisiveness within both this country and throughout the world. I believe today we have greater divisiveness, greater lack of civility between points of view. And I think that plays into this personally. But so where are we? What are your thoughts? I know you're an optimist. I've known you long enough to know that you are an optimist. So I'd like
Optimists
to
also have to be realists. Okay? Golda Meir once said Jews don't have the luxury of being pessimists. And having survived the Shoah, the Holocaust as a child, when 1.5 million Jewish children perished, I certainly don't have the right to be pessimistic. But we have to be realistic. Oslo was a dream. Again, part of the problem of dreamers is they lose sight of reality. And they assume that what's in their heart and in their mind is what motivates the other side. And so, Oslo was a belief on our side that the other side is where we are. Wants peace, yearns for peace, will sacrifice for peace. And, after the signing and all the celebrations, very little change. In fact, worse yet. So Israel recognized the concept of a Palestinian authority, talked about two-state solutions, and then you had a slew of suicide bombs, and you had the Intifada. Rabin was murdered by us, so that it isn't always all one-sided, but unfortunately, the fact that we don't have peace with the Palestinians today is because, regardless what you think about Bibi and Bibi yes and Bibi no, the fact is that certainly under Begin, who was the right-wing whatever, you had Sadat and you had peace. And why was there peace? And it was a painful peace. Israel gave up an awful lot. Right? Israel vacated cities, removed graves, synagogues, etc. Why? Because Sadat said, and he paid a price for it, I recognize your right to be and to live. And that was the basis, and then Begin gave him everything. In fact, Begin, to some extent, screwed up future prospects of peace, but because after the peace with Egypt, every Arab leader would say, he got everything. I can't afford to take less. Okay? Then you had I remember it historically, but Sharon evacuated Gaza. Evacuated. You said it's settlements, you say it's because we occupy, etc. Okay. Didn't ask anything but to live together, and it didn't last. When Jordan came with peace, and again, what was the side? They recognized Israel's existence. Till you have that, now you can, does Bibi recognize the two-state solution? Does he not? We can debate it. The fact is, at this stage of the game, it's also a question of leadership. You need constellations to line up. You need strong leadership in Israel, because only strong leadership will take risks for peace. You needed the Palestinians, and you needed the U.S. I don't know where the U.S. is on Israel. I will also say to you that at a certain point in time, I think there used to be an African-American comedian who would say, the devil made me do it. Flip Wilson. Remember Flip Wilson? He would deal with everything, the devil made me do it. If you want to see peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, you need the devil to make them do it. And the devil to make them do it is America. It's not Russia, it's not China, it's America. Because both of them will have to go to their extremes and say, listen, I don't want to do this, I don't want to compromise here, but listen, it's the United States of America. It's not happening now. It's not happening now. We don't know where it is and where it's going. But it also needs a strong America, a respected America, a leadership America, where the rest of the world is going to respect. But finally on the issue of peace is, with all the great hopes and expectations, you need self-interest. If it's in the self-interest, you're talking now about Bahrain, you're talking about Iraq, all of a sudden, you remember the Arab-Israel conflict, how many Americans, leaders, and European politicians, if we can only solve the Arab-Israel conflict, Mashiach will come to the Middle East, and Shia will live with Sunni. Nonsense. They finally woke up to realize, you know what, it's not the Arab-Israel conflict, it's everything else. It would be nice to solve it. It would be nice. So what is happening in the interim is, it's not in the self-interest of a group of countries to continue their belligerency, because their self-interest is they can get more with an alliance shortly with Israel, but they're still not ready to get out of the closet until they're ready. Listen, we've met with Arab leaders, you and I have met, that I can't tell you about. Well, big deal. Big deal. If they're in the closet with us, it doesn't mean anything. They need the courage to stand up and say, the time has come. So there is a growing self-interest. There is a growing realization that it's not the central issue of peace in the Middle East, but it is something that could help. But we're of Taurus because we don't have American leadership. And so don't hold your breath. It's not going to happen around the corner.
Abe, you introduced me to Bruce Kashdan when I was working in the Middle East. And one of the things that I remember clearly that he said to me is, they're never going to recognize us because they love us. It's going to be because there's a self-interest. And that's what he was working on. Bruce Kashdan was an ambassador at large for Israel that met with Arab countries that didn't recognize Israel. He went there.
That's when you come to Abu Dhabi and they say, we're looking for Cohen. You say, oh, you mean Cohen the spy? He's on the second floor. That was Bruce Kashdan.
And so he tried to enter into joint economic deals with those countries. And one of the deals he told me about, he said, but I couldn't tell anybody. He'd just come from Qatar, where they had entered into a deal with respect to a fishery. He said, you can't tell anybody about it because it's shrimp. All right, with that, let's open up the floor to questions. Jesse?
We've got note cards, so hold them up if you have questions.
Okay, we have note cards, hold them up, and we'll take as many of your questions as we can.
Marty, give me those. Give me those.
Well, I would love to have them, like, take this one and whenever it goes, like, I know, but
I can get it. Okay. Marty, let me have the question.
they want some blank ones or
Yeah.
something.
Here, Jesse, let me see what else you got here.
New cards.
Here, give Jesse
Yeah.
that one.
I'm gonna go ahead and start with what I have. The first question, Abe, what do you say to Jews, even rabbis, who support BDS and certainly don't consider themselves anti-Semites?
You give them my analysis. and a blessing. Listen, we need to have the tolerance we need to have the tolerance to accept people's views that we disagree with and who we think are wrong. That's part of who we are. It's always been Shammai and Hillel and Shammai. Okay. The problem. I just read an article that we should retire self-hating Jew as a concept. I think so. I don't know what that means, but what I find, one of the arguments I use when it's a one-on-one is, okay, you know what? You have this point of view. Do you know that those who want to destroy the Jewish state, without any philosophical or halakhic or whatever, use you. Use your words, your positions, in order to strengthen their attack against Israel. It's worked with some, and we have to show them how they're being used. But you know what? It's not the first time in our history, it won't be the last time. They're entitled. It's sad. For one Jew not to understand is painful, but they're entitled.
I sort of look at this as a related question, and I think I know your answer to this one. J Street, are they anti-Semites?
No. Again, we need to be precise in our terminology. Now, I'm sure there are some, anti-Semites, but no. J Street has a different view about peace in Israel. J Street has a lot of people in Israel who agree with them or they agree with their point of view. There are other issues. I think the word anti-Semitism, they are not for BDS, by the way. They've changed their mind. They at one point were, now they're not, but basically, if you really take a look at their positions, they're not for BDS. I think it's a legitimate position because it's a position espoused in Israel. On the other hand, positions in Israel is one thing, positions abroad is another. So I'll give you my own personal view. They are not anti-Semites. But what troubles me? I have taken a position in public, as private Jewish life, that if I don't like what Israel does, if I disagree with the policy, I will find my way to an ambassador here, to a consul general, if it's important enough, take a plane and whisper in the ears of the Israelis that I think that it's not smart for them, it may hurt them, it is not productive, and I can't publicly support it. There have been some instances where I have gone public, and I'll mention one in a moment. Because what I believe is that the Israelis have the total right to be right and wrong. Because if their policy is wrong and their government and their people make a mistake, God forbid, the consequences of their decisions are life and death. If I or you or J Street take a position on settlements or whatever, on security issues, I'm not talking about who's a Jew, right? I'm talking about security issues or related security issues. And we're going to be wrong. Something happens, and we're wrong. Our opinion was, there was this whole issue of, do you support Sharon or not? When Sharon wanted to withdraw from Gaza, okay? And yeah, I had a position, I whispered it into Sharon's ear. Because Sharon did it, and if you will, made a mistake. You want to count how many Israelis were killed because of the withdrawal? Because of the wars in Gaza, where Gaza went? But you know what? They were entitled to be wrong. You and I and J Street are not entitled to be wrong on issues of security. So, and what happens is we mix up this issue on issues of who's a Jew, and whether the cut on the Western Wall, and women's rights. These are issues which touch us all. These are not issues of policy determinations, which have very, very serious consequences. So I would say to J Street, you have an opinion on Iran, whisper it in my ear or the Prime Minister's ear. Don't go on a campaign in Congress. Now, I took a position on Iran, so I'll give you an example where I violated my own whatever. I criticized the Prime Minister of Israel when he came to Congress to give a speech on Iran. I did it, I thought, very delicately. He didn't think it was delicate, but that's okay. I said I wasn't sure that it was in the best interest to give the speech where he gave it at that time. Now, here too, I thought he was right on the issue of Iran. I thought that going to Congress, at that time, made this more of a political issue than an issue on Iran. But in retrospect, maybe I should have kept my comments privately to it, etc. So remember, J Street is not anti-Semitic. J Street has a right to speak. Is it wise? What are the consequences? That's the conversation you should have privately with people who say, so they say, well, these are views in Israel. But okay, in Israel they live and die by it. And here you'll go to a cocktail party and say, I was wrong. That's the big difference.
I've gotten a high sign, so only two more questions. First one, you said that anti-Semitism is protected in the U.S. by the First Amendment. What impact does hate crime prosecution, hate crime legislation, which I know ADL was instrumental in getting passed, affect anti-Semitism in states where it's protected?
Okay, it doesn't eliminate it, okay, and but it sends a message. Messages are important. The message basically is, I'll go back to it in a second. The message is that the organized community cares about the subject of anti-Semitism. If we had another hour, we can discuss what's going on in Congress with anti-BDS legislation, etc. And there too, there are all kinds of constitutional issues, freedom of speech issues. To me, at the end of the day, you know what it is? Anti-BDS legislation sends a message. Your governor today, wow, God bless him, went all the way on BDS and Airbnb. Like him or not, doesn't matter. But it sends a message that America and Americans stand very strong. hate crimes legislation, remember, does not create a crime. If you, again, so those who are not lawyers, not. If you commit arson for insurance, and the penalty is 1 year in prison and $1,000, what hate crimes legislation does is it says, if that same arson we can prove was created because you don't want your guy being your neighbor, it's 2 years and $2,000. It doesn't create the crime of arson, so speech does not create. But what it says very clearly is our society, wherever that legislation is passed, so believes that hate is contrary to what our community is about, that if you do it motivated by hate, it doesn't create a crime. Because what you think here or in here does not create a crime. Thought does not create a crime. But if there's a crime and you engage in that crime because of hate, there's an additional penalty. What it says, we've always said, and an attack against the Jews is an attack against the community. What does that mean? What does that mean? Sounds good. Well, it has meaning if in fact the community really stands behind it. And therefore, hate crimes legislation or anti-BDS legislation is a very clear message to the bigots and to the non-bigots. Hey, be careful. This is serious. This society, this state, this governor, this mayor, this Congress considers this to be seriously anti-American, anti-what values that we believe in. And that's very, very important. It doesn't win all the battles, but it helps you in the fight.
Okay. Abe, the last question, and you can give the short answer on this one if you'd like. Or more. The question is, can you tell us about your childhood during the Holocaust? I almost chose not to ask this one, but I have.
Okay. All right, I'll give you the...
Yeah.
Go ahead. Good story.
I was born in Poland in 1940. Poland was not a good place for a Jewish kid to be born in 1940. My parents lived in Warsaw. They moved ahead of the Germans. They moved east. And I was born in a place, Baranovich, which now is Belarus. My parents traveled to try to stay ahead of the Germans. My parents traveled to try to stay ahead of the Germans. So as a family unit of 3, my mother, my father, and I was a year old, with my nanny, traveled east. The Germans caught up with us in the capital of Lithuania, in Vilna. Order went out for all the Jews to go into a ghetto. My parents made a decision that they never were able to rationalize and explain. They did the most unparent thing to separate from their child. Willingly. I mean, they made the decision. My nanny said to them, this will be over in a couple of weeks. You're going to go to the ghetto, you'll get out, I'll take care of them. And so they left me with her. They went to the ghetto. 4 years later, they survived, and she hid me, baptized me, protected me, shielded me, risked her life 4 years to protect me. My parents survived by miracles, separate stories. My mother got false papers on the Aryan side, would come to visit my nanny and myself, would provide, steal, smuggle to make sure that we have provisions. I knew my mother was my aunt, my nanny was my mother. I spit on Jews as I passed on the street on the way to church. I was indoctrinated well. I was lucky to have been blonde and blue-eyed or greenish or whatever eyes, and blonde. It helped. I was circumcised. That didn't help. By the way, But I never realized, we had a conference 25 years ago of hidden children. I looked at the audience and was overwhelmed by the fact that the overwhelming majority of the audience were women. And after I asked some of the scholars, was it because of longevity, and it turned out no. It was much easier to hide a Jewish child which was female than a Jewish child which was male and circumcised. And even some of the boys were raised as girls in hiding. So she had the additional thing of protecting me. Through miracles, my parents survived. We were reunited. We were liberated by the Soviets. And my nanny, who risked her life to save me, basically said to my parents, I saved him, he belongs to me in the Catholic Church. And she then proceeded to try to get my father arrested by the Soviets as a collaborator. They arrested him 3 times, they let him go, and eventually the Soviets said to my parents, we don't have time for these family squabbles, you have to take this to court. And so it was the first custody battle in Soviet-liberated Europe. The court ruled I belonged to my parents. The Soviets, after the war, permitted people who were displaced and dislocated during the war to go back to where they came from. So we came from Poland, we went back to Poland, my parents and I, separated from my nanny, my mother. She followed in Poland. Her family was in Poland. Her family kidnapped me. My parents and their friends kidnapped me back. We then smuggled the borders as displaced Turks till we got to Bratislava, from Bratislava to Austria and the American zone. I was never said thank you to her, never had an opportunity to say goodbye, because the last time was in the kidnapping episode. My parents sent her money in packages from 1958. She never acknowledged, except she had to sign, it was return receipt. She had to sign that she received it. And then we got a notice from the local postal authorities not to send any more packages because she passed away. So I never had the opportunity to say goodbye and thank you. My father, a blessed memory, when we smuggled the borders, hid in his clothing, sewn in, pictures of her. And so many years later, every time I had a fight with my parents, it was left me. And then when I tried to begin to understand, I asked him why he took these pictures with him, because the Border Patrol could have rejected our claim that we were Turks, because I was told that I'm deaf and dumb, because I spoke Polish and Russian, some Turk. Okay? And he said to me that he wasn't sure whether I would remember her, and for the rest of my life, he wanted to make sure that I had the image of Branislava Korpi in front of my eyes. And so that's why he risked taking out the pictures. On a subsequent conversation, I asked him if she loved me so much, why did she do all these terrible things of trying to get my father arrested and kidnapping me, etc. And a lesson of wisdom that I didn't understand then, try to understand now, is he said to me, anything in excess is no good. Too rich, too poor, too smart, too stupid, too tall, too short, too much love and too much hate. Anything in excess. Hers was too much love. And that love turned into hate to undermine my relationship. And finally, because I guess somebody said I shouldn't ask, and that's, my return to Judaism. So halachically, it's very simple. If I had not been circumcised, you can do it later, but ways of doing it. But halachically, once a Jew, always a Jew. So there's nothing, no ritual, nothing magic that you need to do. If you really care about the legal, there was a case in Israel, the brother Daniel, which was a Jew who converted to be saved, became a priest, and then came to Israel and said, I want to be a citizen by the law of return. And the Israeli court said, no, you're always Jewish, so here is a Jew converted, became a priest, and the court ruled, you're a Jew for obligations, but you're not a Jew for privileges. But it worked. No, because seriously, can you imagine if the Catholic Church could say you can convert and still be a Jew for all practical purposes? So there's nothing that I had to do. My father, I learned, was much wiser than I gave him credit for during the years of parenthood. And the first time he took me to synagogue was on Simchas Torah. Simchas Torah is one of the most festive periods in Jewish synagogue ritual. And it was in 45, after the liberation, in Vilna, where all the surviving Jews, those who found their way to synagogue, came to the synagogue to celebrate survival in Jewish life. On the way to synagogue, I passed the church, I grabbed my father's hand, I crossed myself, we went on to church. I was a very, very devout Catholic, being raised. I passed the priest, grabbed my father's hand, kissed the hand of the priest, and off we went to synagogue. In synagogue, a Soviet Jewish officer in uniform approached my father and asked him whether I was Jewish. And he said yes. And the officer asked my father whether he can take me and dance with me. He said he traveled thousands of kilometers, did not see a Jewish child. And he took me on the shoulders and he danced with me. I came home and I said to my mother, my nanny, I like the Jewish church. They sing and dance. One more story in terms of, and again, it's on the question of how do you return. I was 6. Catholics say, give me a child till 6 and I'll hold him. So I was just waiting a little bit before 6. My father understood, in ways that were so significant. I used to, every night, get on my knees and pray to God in Latin. My father, at a certain point, said to me, you pray every night, you don't have to kneel, and he taught me the Shema. They were both Greek to me. I didn't understand Latin, I didn't understand Hebrew. All I knew was that before I go to sleep, I prayed to Boże, I prayed to God. And I used to wear a cross. And at a certain point, my father took off the cross and put on a talit katan, which is a little talus. And again, for me, it was not theological. It wasn't who's right, who's wrong, etc. To me, it was faith and ritual, and as long as I continued to pray, and as long as I had something close to my heart, and then in the beginning we went to church and synagogue, till we were in DP camps where there were all Jewish children, etc. And so that became the norm. So I was very, very blessed. Finally, I was raised in tradition, which means I was raised in Shabbos, I was raised in Kashrus, and I was sent to yeshiva. And at a certain point, as a teenager, when you begin to ask questions, and I began to understand what it is that I survived, I said to my father, how could you teach me faith? And he said to me, some people came into the Holocaust believing and walked out atheists. Some came out atheists and walked out believing. Some came in believing and left believing. And he said to me, God gave man a choice of good and evil. What happened in the Holocaust was the act of man, a choice of man. My father of blessed memory saw miracle, saw God's revelation by our survival and by other stories that he saw. And so the faith continues. But it's not only the faith there, but it's the faith in the Jewish people. I think all of us, all of us, have the God-given right to make the choices and to make a difference. So thank you for being here, because that's the first step.